Digital Society, an irregular podcast about life with technology produced by Dr. Travis Holland, that's me, at Charles Sturt University. For this first episode of Digital Society in 2024, I'm joined by Tom Fishenden. Tom is a charity communication expert, content creator, creative, and all-round good guy. Hey, Tom.
Hey, how's it going?
Not too bad. Answer me a question. Would you like to fight for civil rights or tweet a racial slur?
Fight for civil rights, 100. Interesting opening. Wasn't expecting a
Well,
song lyric.
In this episode, we are going to tackle Bo Burnham's Inside. Comedian Bo Burnham released this musical special in 2021, having recorded it entirely inside his house during the COVID-19 pandemic. The whole thing takes an interesting look at technology and what makes us tick, so I thought it would be the perfect introduction to this 2024 series. Tom, which song's your favourite?
Oh, I feel like Welcome to the Internet is one that everybody goes for.
Yeah.
But I actually really like comedy just because of how it layers in some quite serious stuff into a song that's really catchy.
Yeah. Okay. You've got some pretty strong, detailed thoughts on this.
Yeah.
Initially, I said, come and talk to me about Welcome to the Internet. And you said, no, we're going to do the whole album. So let's go. Let's go. Dive in. Tell me about the context that Burnham sets up before he hits the songs as such.
Yeah, so I feel like Inside really chiefly addresses three things, and you kind of see this as you go through the songs. They're sort of particular pertinent themes throughout. Obviously, as you touched on, the prevalence of digital technology and how that's changed the way we interact with people, either for good or for bad, is quite a big example.
Mm-hmm.
But equally, you have a lot of reference to some of the real sort of genuine challenges that society is facing as a whole at the moment. And then, of course, because of the timing of this, you also have that mixed in with the fallout of the pandemic as well. And it's really interesting because across the board, when you look at Inside, it's very, very catchy. The songs are very well structured, but actually some of the jokes, like you said at the top of the show, are quite near to the mark and sometimes vulgar. And that's done in a really deliberate manner because what you see throughout Inside is you have these kind of quite dark jokes to juxtapose the importance of the messaging. And I think sort of as digital communicators, that's really interesting because this is an example of a piece of work that uses means that you traditionally wouldn't want to touch with a 10-foot barge pole to make something that's actually really memorable.
He really goes to the heart of some of the trauma, I guess, of COVID-19, you know, aside from kind of the death, but that kind of collective experience of being trapped inside the house and having technology as our only kind of lifeline. And what does that do to us? Like, he almost plays that off as if that's a metaphor for what is happening in society generally, right?
Yeah, it's a really interesting way of comparing the two and sort of having them running in parallel because you do have this quite pertinent commentary on the use of technology, but then I think just sort of the discussion around the ethics and morality of technology more broadly was so pushed into overdrive by the pandemic because you sort of had this technology that was evolving and developing alongside us, and then suddenly when you're stuck indoors, that technology gets pushed into overdrive, and this really sort of looks at some of the fallout of that as well, I think.
Let's start on the songs then. What do you want to run through them in order, or what's your thinking? I think you know this better than me, right? Yeah. The reason I'm kind of turning to you for this is because I think you're a bit younger than me, right? And my analysis of this whole thing is that it was really targeted to Gen Zs, to younger millennials.
Hi.
And I probably kind of missed it, right? But here you are. So how should we approach this?
Yeah, I think if we run through it in order, it kind of gives a structure for how the things unfold in the show as well, which I think, you know, if you're watching it for the first time after listening to this, why not use this as your companion piece?
Listen to us first and then go out and listen to Inside. Yeah. So tell us about that first song then.
Yeah, so the first song is Content, and it's really interesting because it's really short, but it kind of sets the stage for the entire piece. So it's really this concept that our lives are dominated by the online content that we consume. And it's interesting because within any sort of normal situation, you could look at this, particularly the line, "It's a beautiful day to stay inside," and think about how actually that perhaps is a case study on our use of technology as a whole, and the
Mm-hmm.
fact that we're in this culture now where people are consuming content so quickly, so frequently, that that's all they do, and they're maybe missing the life around them. It is
Yeah.
interesting to note that this is one of the shorter songs as well. So in that whole thing, there's an example of our habit to consume short content very, very quickly as well. But what I think stands out particularly with content is, on its own, you'd have this piece that's kind of saying, okay, here's the almost consumerism culture around online content, but it's juxtaposed with the context of a pandemic. So you kind of have this thing about digital content in an era where digital content is proliferating. I mean, you look at Disney, you look at game studios, you look at any kind of entertainment sector, they skyrocketed during the pandemic. We're now sadly seeing a lot of layoffs because that hasn't been sustainable. But you look
Mm-hmm.
back at those initial days, and that really was sort of everyone jumping on the content trend and pushing as much out as quickly as they could.
So the content kind of becomes our world, right?
Yes.
In that kind of context. And again, I think he's probably trying to commentate on uh how that exists or how that plays out in life generally, not just
Yeah.
during the pandemic, but obviously the pandemic is the kind of inciting incident, to use a sort of novel or
Yeah.
film description term. Yeah. Um, the next song is comedy.
Yes.
What happens in this one?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting because it's sort of an interesting commentary on the real world and sort of the severity of a lot of the incidences that we're dealing with in the real world and the sort of challenges that we're continuing to face,
Hmm.
versus sort of, other vocational careers that perhaps aren't going to have a societal impact on that. So I think this is really interesting because the lines "is comedy over," and "should I be joking at a time like this," particularly cut through to what we've seen a lot with the growth of online communities, which is a sense that everybody feels as if they have to be a part of social mobility and they have to get involved in certain things, and be a part of that collective challenge to change good. And while that's fantastic that there is that really rallying sense of community around trying to make a positive difference in the world, I think it also leads a lot more to people sort of questioning their purpose in life, whether the jobs they're doing are perhaps fulfilling and whether they're having the impact they want, and whether really they are making that difference. And I think the thing that's really interesting here is there is a lot of an undertone of privilege here as well, and sort of a commentary on privilege and how certain people from certain demographics have the luxury of choosing certain careers. And also how that can then lead to a disconnect. So the thing that always stands out to me, and I won't repeat some of the lines in this section, but the bit where Bo is essentially saying, "Don't panic and I'll tell you a joke," in a lot of different scenarios, it kind of juxtaposes the disconnect between that caricature that he's creating, and the real world trials and tribulations that they're experiencing. So it's really a really interesting song in itself because on the one hand you have this really valid commentary about how important social mobility is, and on the other hand you have this reflection of how people who perhaps have come from a more privileged background are disconnected from that and don't necessarily see it for the value that it has.
And so it's kind of getting at this point again of, you mentioned the pressure to be involved in movements, right,
Yeah.
and to conform to a particular way. This is a kind of there's always been a sense of you have to fit in with the norms of the community, but
Yeah.
on the internet you kind of have to fit in with the norms of every community, otherwise they come
Yeah.
they come after you. And that's become that's a real challenge for anyone really to navigate, to figure out where the line is in every community simultaneously, I guess, and to account for every possible interpretation, spin, or taste all at
Yeah.
once.
It's
Um,
really interesting because it sort of gets to I think a shift you see particularly in politics now as well, which is people are very divided, and it's
Hmm.
really hard for people to find common ground, especially in politics, but also in other environments. And I think so much of that comes down to that idea of people feeling like they need to commit themselves solely to a community and adhere by the guidelines in that community. And like you say, it's so reinforced by the internet, where that's now, I guess, so much more visible than it would have ever been before.
A sort of trend, even just in these first two songs, right, of posing this question of what role does. So obviously, the first one's about content, the second one's about comedy. On the surface, what role does this stuff play in society? And
Yeah,
it's going to that sense of the going right back into sort of theatrical theory and history of commedia dell'arte, or the sort of the comedian on the side. Mikhail Bakhtin's another theorist who pointed to some of this sort of stuff in society, and then you get the notion of the jester, right?
yeah,
The court jester is the only one who's allowed to tell the truth to the king, sort of
yeah,
thing. Um, and that kind of role in society is now occupied, I guess, by our comedians, but they're still subject to these pressures, to
yeah,
constantly produce, and then to fit in with the prevailing sort of trends of the time. So he then jumps into a more personal song called "FaceTime with My Mum Tonight." Now,
yeah,
again, I think this is a really relatable song. It's one that people can pick up and say, "Yeah, this is how I was um, feeling at this time, because this is the only way I was able to connect with family members, or whatever it might
yeah.
be." Is that how you read this song?
Yeah, so again, I think there's sort of a split message in it, which is that, in one sense, the digital screen becoming a replacement for that face-to-face connection, and actually filling that void during the period of time that was COVID. But it's interesting because of this show, and particularly the themes of the show that you're working on. I kind of tried to look at each song through a digital lens.
Hmm.
And for this, the song particularly, I think this says so much about the generational divide in technology. So throughout this song, you sort of have his mum trying to learn how to use the phone. That was a very British mum,
Hmm.
versus Bo knowing sort of already how to use the technology and getting frustrated with her lack of technological ability. And I think that gets to a real point of challenge, which many people faced during the pandemic, which was older generations perhaps struggling to adapt to the transition to technology. And equally, when you think about society more broadly, older people perhaps struggling to adapt to the technology that young people have grown up with and so are then used to as it becomes more a part of everyday life.
Yeah.
So I think there's that really interesting thing around the generational divide and also digital poverty, which is actually a really massive and pertinent issue that isn't really spoken about a lot at all.
I saw an interesting thread going around today talking about the push to return to the office,
Yes.
and that often that's put down to the generational divide. But the author was saying we should reconsider that it's not just about older people's inability to learn technology, but it's also about the fact that for a lot of younger people in white collar jobs, obviously, um, going home and working from home, you were still using the same tools you used every day. But
Yeah.
for the managers and the middle managers, some of the tools they use every day weren't actually available, like presence, like connection with people face to face. Those are the
Yeah.
things that actually, when you think of them as a tool, were the things that weren't available. And it's perhaps coming to why now there's a push to return to the office. If you look at it charitably. If you look at it uncharitably, you'd say it's just about corporate ownership of office space in the CBDs.
No comment.
Um, but yeah, there's an interesting, there's a line there that says, and again on the surface, she'll hold her iPhone 5 no further than 6 inches from her face. So it really drives home that line, and then she's covering the camera with her thumb and those kinds of questions as well. So, world works. Do you want to jump onto that one?
Yeah. Yeah, so this is a really interesting one because I think that this is the first one where you kind of deviate from the digital communication thread. And this is more a reflection on society. And I think it's really interesting because essentially what I would summarize this as is talking about the dark side of world history and the dark side of world affairs. And
Hmm.
particularly touching on the fact that in the education system, for example, we tend to focus on positives. We don't always reflect on the negatives and the bad that has been done to get society to where it is. Um, and I think there is sort of an element of this in the digital world as well, where it sort of hints at online culture and how you can see a perceived good and not necessarily see everything else that goes to get to that point, which is something that White Women's Instagram, the next song, then builds on quite significantly. But I think the main point for this is the idea that actually, I guess as a society, people like to hold themselves up as maybe being right or being morally just without necessarily appreciating the things that have happened to get them to the point of privilege that they hold in the first place.
It's a challenging song in a way because it's.
Yeah,
I guess they all have a certain message, but this one kind of says this is what you need to pay attention to
yeah.
directly. Um,
I think this
the,
one as well, where you have the sock puppet, it kind of almost slaps you around the face with it, for a want of a different phrase, because you're
mhm,
expecting something quite nice and comical, and what the sock puppet comes out with is actually pretty dark and bleak.
yeah. I'm just revisiting the lyrics here, and he says, "Where have you been, Socko? I've always been where I've been where I am when you're not wearing me on your hand, in a frightening liminal space between
Yeah,
states of being not quite dead, not quite alive."
yeah,
That plays with something that I think we can talk about when we get to Welcome to the Internet, which is this kind of, and I guess it's in comedy as well. Burnham plays the role of this kind of vaudevillian, or this like
yeah,
circus ringmaster, like guiding us through this kind of crazy world that you're about to, like a Willy Wonka type character. I
yeah,
think he's very, he stands there in the middle, and he says, "This is my circus here, right? This is my show. I'm going to show you all how it works." But at the same time as he's doing that, he's still using sleight of hand, and he's still using the tricks to keep us on our toes a little bit. So
yeah.
this one, the next song is a song that I have a really interesting story about. I went on a road trip
Okay.
with my dad last year, and my dad is someone who is very hesitant to nominate things that he like to say outright what he wants to do. He's a very reserved kind of person. But we
Yeah,
went on this road trip, and I was trying to get him to pick some music, and he wouldn't pick. So I just hit my Spotify playlists,
yeah.
play whatever. And White Woman's Instagram came on. Now, my dad, honestly, I don't think he'd ever heard the word Instagram before, let alone half the other words in this song. He's someone who barely knows what Facebook is and certainly hasn't used it, let alone Instagram. So, I'm not even getting him started on TikTok. But this this song can feel like an attack on a certain kind of person.
Yeah.
It probably is really, but what's your take on it?
It's interesting because I hadn't thought about it through that lens, but I think absolutely it can feel like that. I think it's interesting because for me, the first thing I wrote when I was making notes about this was that it's fundamentally based on a stereotype,
Mm,
and it's not shy about it at all. Right, it's in the title of the song. But I think when thinking about this deeper, the crux of the song is really how online culture wants you to often perform in a certain way or present things in a certain way. In this case, as a really sort of like positive, highly polished, highly edited, and curated sort of online presence. Just to get that content to perform well and that engagement to perform well. And I think it's really interesting because it shows how content that we see online is often perfected, and it's not as organic as those everyday interactions. And I think the thing that really drives that home in this song is you get sort of all of these really polished, like fairly cinematic studio shots, which is impressive in itself considering how Burnham produced this. But you get all of these quite curated shots. And then when you get to the moment where Bo is reflecting on, in this case, the character's mother and that photo with the mother, that kind of all falls away. And I think that's really interesting because it shows that sort of contrast between your online persona and perhaps what you're actually feeling and what the real life experience there is.
Yeah, and again, he's drawing attention to something in order to say it's not that important anyway.
Yeah.
This notion of the perfect life that's being presented through this particular way with these filters and these types of images and quotes and whatever the hell else you might say on the particular type of feed that he's talking about.
Yeah.
He's drawing attention to the stereotype in order to subvert it, but like all good stereotypes, I don't know if that's an oxymoron, but like all stereotypes, there's a kind of kernel of truth there as well. That's why it works. Yeah. Unpaid intern. I think this one that speaks very much to Gen Z.
Yes.
And
yes. This one I think is so simple, but it is really a reflection on the idea that with modern job culture, so many jobs will want you to go to like an entry-level job with 4 years experience and 14 different qualifications and all of those kinds of things. So it's quite simple, but it reflects in 40 seconds, maybe slightly more, what so many people sort of entering the job market and going into those modern roles are experiencing.
Yeah, that's probably all we need to say about that one. But then if we're
talking
talking about
me, okay?
You can have a cry later on. We're going to keep moving. But then we get to possibly, if we're thinking about the digital world we live in, one of the most individually most transformative people in that framework, and that's Jeff Bezos. So
yeah,
Bezos 1, or is it Bezos I? Have I got that?
I always look at it as Bezos 1. But I think this is interesting because this kind of sort of comes out of left field. And yes, it is one of the most transformative people. But I think it's interesting because naturally the way that he presents these songs, they have an air of power to them. Like the way they're designed, they're quite grandiose. They sort of give that idea of a big, interesting figure. But it's really interesting because it's juxtaposed with a lot of stories that were coming out around the time of the release of the show and then subsequently afterwards about all of these horrible things that Amazon were doing to their employees, about the way they were being mistreated. So I find it really fascinating that it's again how you can almost within an online culture, I suppose, get this figurehead who is lifted up and empowered without necessarily knowing what has taken that person to that position of power. And I think, like you were saying earlier, he sort of gives us, in many ways, things which are the opposite of what's going on in the real world. And that's a really interesting way that he handles Bezos, because obviously there were all of those stories out at the time.
He gives these kinds of biographical facts initially, right? And then at the end of the song, he compares Bezos to Zuckerberg, Gates, and Buffett. So he kind of puts them all there together in this same and I'm not going to read the rest of those lyrics, but he puts them all there together
in this same kind of
framework. Bezos 1, because then, in fact, later on there's Bezos 2. So we might jump ahead and deal with that one now, if that's all right. So how do you see that one reflecting or changing the message of the earlier one?
It's interesting because I think that it just feels even more powerful in terms of a song. So it's kind of like over the course of the show, you get the progression of Bezos as a character from somebody who is already powerful to even more powerful. And I think that's interesting because obviously that reflects the fact that around the time, I think he became the most richest person in the world. And then that shifted, it changed again. But it's just an interesting reflection on sort of, I guess, the power that one individual can have over society.
Yeah, and while holding that one individual up to this critique, he's also drawing our attention back to the fact that we're all still consuming and buying stuff from Amazon, right? Like,
Yeah,
it's not Jeff Bezos cracking the whip necessarily in the Amazon warehouses, it's the purchases.
yeah.
It's the expectation that your stuff gets delivered in 24 hours.
It sort of
Um,
highlights the uncomfortable implicity, doesn't it?
yeah, absolutely. We can definitely say the lyrics in the second one in Bezos too, because it's just his name for
Yeah.
80% of the time, right? that's the that's the
Right,
lyric.
so I've got to tell you, the first time I saw her inside, I was round my friend's house. So I'd gone round to see a friend who had come down and I hadn't seen for ages. And we are just sat eating pizza, and he was like, "Oh, I've seen this really funny thing come onto Netflix. Let's put it on." And when Bezos 2 came on, we were just sat losing our minds, absolutely cracking up.
Absolutely see. I can absolutely see it. I think yeah, it's it's pretty wild. So
It is.
let's talk sexting, Tom.
Yeah, wow. I thought you'd never ask, Travis.
Don't threaten me with a good time. Okay.
Yeah, so this is, well, firstly, this is the song that I always skip whenever I have this playing out loud, just because,
You don't want people to hear
but
you listening to it?
no. um, but I think it's really interesting because it gets to the crux of how technology has fundamentally changed what we perceive as normal relationships.
Yeah.
And, I think there is a question of, if someone is able to get sexual gratification from a phone or from another digital device, how does that affect the social dynamic of their relationship? How does that affect what they perceive as the norms within that relationship? And I think it's really interesting because it shows how technology has changed the norms that we associate with relationships. But there's then also an undercurrent of how easy it is to miscommunicate. And I'm not going to repeat the lines, but there's some points around social cues, and how easy it can be for communication through digital messaging to be misconstrued. So it
Mhm.
kind of has this one track, which is, hey, actually, what is society now? This is where people's relationships come from. And equally, what is society where something can be misinterpreted so quickly?
Without getting too deep into the notion of an edible complex, this is almost the mirror to the FaceTiming my mum, right? Because
Yes.
it's this is how this particular form of relationship is being mediated and changed and
Yeah.
shaped by technology, which is also the story of the mum not being able to use
Yeah.
FaceTime,
I
and
really
the
like that
misinterpretations that
comparison
happen.
because when you think about like traditional perceptions of what certain demographics might think of technology, you then essentially have the perception of a good use of technology and a bad use of technology and how they compare.
Mm. But both of, I guess, the generation he's talking to are both on one side of this equation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, Look who's inside again. This is
Yeah,
kind
so
of, yeah. Go for it.
it's quite a simple one, really. I think this is just a reflection on the longevity of COVID. Firstly, which is, oh my god, is this thing still going on? Am I still stuck inside?
Mm,
But equally, also, I think there's an interesting little notion here about the idea of content creation as a career. And the fact that when, say, you do Twitch or you do other content creation, you don't necessarily get that sort of organic interaction that tells you you're doing a good job. And the thing that I think really sticks with me with this is the line, "Can one be funny when stuck in a room?" So it's that
mm.
idea that if you're just in a room alone, you're not getting those social cues or those interactions. So how do you know if what you're doing is truly having the impact you want?
What's interesting though is, in a way, like you've got the likes streaming on if you're doing something on
Yeah,
Twitch, or if you're doing something on social media, you get that kind of instant gratification. Whereas
yeah,
actually, for something like television production or I came up through radio broadcasting, and I'd be up at 6 a.m. and sitting in this tiny freezing little radio booth in the middle of nowhere, because that was kind of where our station could
Yeah.
afford rent. And there was literally no nobody, no
Yeah.
audience. There was no way to tell anything about that. So actually, it's not just an internet technology thing. It's for me, I see, that's a media thing in general. Sitting in
Yeah.
those booths and trying to figure out how is this landing. So
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think it gets to that thought of it's so instant that if suddenly it's not there, that can instantly begin those thoughts of, am I funny? Is this going well? It's sort of
yeah,
this culture where I guess creators almost feel like their work has to be validated all of the time or else it's not good enough.
and whether you just delete something if it's not landing within sort of half an hour,
Oh,
or
I know, I've been there and I've done that, and I feel
yeah.
ashamed every time I do it. But if I'm like, oh, LinkedIn especially, if there's like a post with one like, I'm like, okay, this post is gone.
I quite like LinkedIn for certain things, but it has that kind of weird reputation as well,
Yeah,
of this kind of weird place where, while the internet is filtered, LinkedIn is like filtered and then groomed and then slapped in a suit,
yeah,
and the suit's brushed down for with a lint roller sort of thing, and then it's posted online, and so it's like filtered to the nth degree sort of thing.
yeah,
um which is, I guess it depends what circle you run in, though. If you're posting for um in certain types of corporate roles or corporate communities, that probably does make sense. But again, it's probably dependent on your audience. So,
yeah.
what's problematic, Tom?
So many things, Travis. So many things.
a
Um,
lot of thing, a lot of things we've already said in this recording, I think. So,
so I think problematic is really interesting because it's about the predication of accountability within a digital age. And the thing that always comes to my mind when I think of this is when you see like a political candidate that gets caught out by an old tweet or something they've shared in the past, etc. And I think within a digital context, especially, it really shows how we live in an age where we're expected to be accountable for our actions. And perhaps we're not necessarily given the space to make mistakes or learn because it's
mhm,
all constantly in the public eye. Um, but then again, you do also get the undertones of the generational divide with this, where you get the line "times are changing and I'm getting old" repeated throughout as well. So it sort of calls back to elements of FaceTime with my mum tonight, but also then has those elements of, well, what does accountability look like in a digital age?
mhm. And running throughout this song, in multiple times, he comes back to this mention of an Aladdin costume, right? Which he
Yeah,
says is a problem. He's a problem. I'm a problematic. He's a problem. Uh, and because he dressed up as Aladdin, and he says, "I did not
yeah,
darken my skin, but still it feels weird in hindsight." And he comes back to that again, and he says later on that the costume is still in my mother's attic. I'm going to go
yeah,
home and burn it, right? So he's questioning, I guess, the extent to which we can divorce ourselves from our past as well,
yeah.
whether those performative actions are worth anything nowadays, or um yeah. So do you think it's asking to avoid accountability, or it's saying we need to recognize that people can learn and grow?
I'd like to think it's saying that we'd like to recognise that people can learn and grow. I mean, the person you are today isn't going to be the same person you were last year because you're going to
Hmm.
have had different experiences and different things you've overcome. So I like to think of it as a commentary on that, and actually that people shouldn't necessarily be shackled by what's happened in their past if they're different today. So again, the Aladdin costume is a really good example because actually it's probably something he did when he was younger and a lot more foolish. And I'm sure he regrets that now, but that shouldn't be something that is constantly anchoring him back to that point in his life.
It shows a certain sense of control of your own narrative, to be putting that,
Yeah,
whether it's a factual detail or kind of made up for the song, but to be putting that in the song and owning it as
yeah.
well, which I think can potentially be important. Tom, how old are you?
How old am I? I am
Yeah.
24.
So you're not quite at the point at which Burnham starts to think about, well,
Quite
yeah,
bleak things.
yeah.
Yeah.
The song
No.
we're talking about is 30. I'm approaching
Yeah.
40 at a rapid clip. So I absolutely get where he's coming from. I used to run for miles, used to ride my bike, used to wake up with a smile and go to bed with a dream, but now I'm turning 30. What do you
Yeah.
take from this one?
I think it's so interesting because this whole song speaks to something that is so has been blown so far out of proportion by the prevalence of online technology, which is expectations around achievement, around hitting certain milestones by a certain age, i.e., your career milestones, your achievements in life. And it's really, I think, about how comparison is the thief of all joy. And how in this regard he sort of feels like he compares himself to his granddad fighting in Vietnam at the age he's at. And I think that's really interesting because that is sort of a microcosm for what you see online all the time, which is people comparing themselves sometimes to unrealistic standards. So when you compare this to white women's Instagram as well, within that context, people comparing themselves to standards that are never going to be attainable because they're so polished and there's so much more to them than people realize. So I think it speaks to the constantly evolving world and how people's expectations of what they want to get out of life is almost pressured by the
Mm-hmm.
prevalence of online technology.
Yeah. We're going to keep speeding through these. The next song on the list is "Don't Want to Know."
Yeah. So I this is an interesting one because I think it sort of is the loosest in its message. But I think essentially its looseness is also its greatest strength because it's talking about the disconnectedness of genuine care, I would say. And how when something is online, it's very easy to just sort of bat it away and say, do you know what, I don't care. I saw that on an Instagram post or I saw it on a Twitter post. It doesn't matter to me. I mean, a really good example, you look at some of the events that are going on in the war, right? And well, I was going to say in the world, but we'll go there, in the different wars that are happening
Yeah,
across the
yeah. I
world
was
at
going
the
to say you
moment.
said war, and I was going to
Um,
say wars. There's like,
yeah,
you know,
exactly. So the wars that are happening across the world, it's so easy for people to ignore that when they see it online because they can just bat it away. And that I think is really what Don't Want to Know gets to the crux of, is
hmm.
that actually when there's these big issues going on, it's quite easy for people to just turn a blind eye to them.
Do you think as well we made that reflection on the connection with the audience or the lack of connection with the audience and the feedback. Do you think he's getting to the point at which he's saying here, like, is he literally asking the audience, do you like what I'm doing here, or have I wasted my time?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there is a whole stream to that about engagement as well. I mean, I wrote the phrase false engagement because I think that's something you see a lot as well, where people online, particularly creators, will feign to care about their communities because they know that that's what gets them engagement. But in
Hmm.
actual fact, they don't necessarily care for the feedback that they're getting or the input that those communities are giving. So I think there's an element of that as well. And also, like you say, an element of actually, does he want to know if what he's doing is resonating with
Mm.
people? Because if it doesn't, is he going to feel like it's been a waste and actually he shouldn't have done it in the first place?
Yeah, like he's not going to be able to cope with the answer, with not knowing if they're actually paying attention, or if they care. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, and then the next song is one we've already covered, which is Bezos 2. And
yeah.
then followed by that language warning, and it probably doesn't matter now. The shit.
Yeah. So this one is quite simple. It's just a reflection on the pandemic, really,
Hmm.
and how during the pandemic so much routine fell away. So many people found that their lives were fundamentally changed for the worse as a result of that. And I think that's really what this sort of encapsulates. This is really this and the next song are the two songs that really focus on the beats of the pandemic the most, I feel.
Yeah, so then the next one is the all-time low, and again, he's
Yeah.
probably not talking about just himself here, but trying to capture something about the state of the world, that we're in a pretty bad place at the height of
Yeah,
the pandemic.
exactly. I mean, in this song, he reflects on the very real impact that it's having on his mental health. And I think that's something that so many people experienced during the pandemic. So it touches on a very raw and real feeling for so many people. And I think that's what those two songs combined are kind of trying to do. They're kind of almost taking a break to say, okay, let's step away from the digital world. Here's how this has impacted the real world.
Yeah, and it's not structured the same way as a lot of the others, right? Like,
No.
yeah, the next one we'll get to is probably the most well known and the
Yeah.
catchiest, but it has a lot of structure and planning to it, whereas all time low just doesn't.
It's
It's
basically a monologue.
yeah, yeah. It's definitely a challenging one. Okay, so here we are, the big moment. Welcome to the
Yeah.
internet. What's your take on this one, Tom? We'll spend a bit of time with Welcome to the Internet.
Yeah. So I think Welcome to the Internet is really just a massive case study of how unregulated the internet is. And it's kind of almost an argument for the internet in many ways. So it sort of gives you the goods and bads, right? So you think about what people are exposed to, it references death, it references pornography, but also other things in there. And I think it reflects on how fundamentally the internet has changed how we interact with things, and how it's reached so deeply into our everyday societal norms.
Mm,
Um, so that's sort of your one angle, I would say, is actually what we're exposed to, what our societal norms have become, and how they've been fundamentally changed by the advent of the internet. But then I think you also have elements of how much information we share on the internet, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, what people can learn about you from the internet through some of the lyrics and what they reference.
mm.
And then also the lyric you get repeated throughout is apathy's a tragedy and boredom is a crime. And I think that speaks to how digital technology has almost forced this culture where we need to constantly be stimulated. So I was doing some marketing training the other day, actually, and it said that the average human attention span is 8 seconds now. So
Mm.
if you think about that when it comes to scrolling or consuming content, the internet has sort of created this culture within all of us where we constantly need the next thing, we constantly need that next fix. So in a way, it's almost reflecting on the internet as an addiction, I would say.
It's it definitely poses a challenge to that society of and I'm incredibly guilty of this, of always picking up your phone to
Yeah,
just kill 30 seconds of wait time, right? Like you're looking at your phone when you're waiting for a coffee, and this is a millennial disease. Like the
yeah,
probably the Gen Zs and the alphas, uh, from what I've observed, actually have less of an issue with this. But for people who didn't necessarily have phones in their hands from toddlers, the millennials seem to be more addicted to the phones now. Uh,
yeah,
I think, and so I also find this song really interesting because he really changes his subjective position quite a lot. Like he jumps around between this kind of speaking for his generation or culture and then speaking to them, and sometimes it sounds like he is the internet, or
yeah,
sometimes it sounds like he is some weirdo on the internet, and other times he's kind of the victim of the weirdo on the internet, right? Like
yeah,
he really jumps around, and this is the song for me where he really inhabits that um unnerving Willy Wonka style character. Or
yeah.
in fact, do you know the other character that really is like this is John Hammond from Michael
Yes,
Crichton's Jurassic
yes,
Park. Is this kind of plays everything off, but underneath there's
yeah.
this real edge. There's this real
It's like a
nastiness.
showmaster, isn't it? Like
Yeah,
presenting almost nasty, evil things as if they're magical and fantastical. And I think you really hit the nail on the head with all the different perspectives, where that's him as the showmaster sort of taking us through all those perspectives and saying, look, this is one impact the internet can have, this is another one, but keep going because there's another one. And it kind of introduces you to some of the positives, some of the negatives, but it never gives you the time to process them. It's always taking it forward to really emphasize the pace of the technology as well.
But actually, it does. This song, he sort of suddenly pauses and the music slows down, right? And
Yes.
and this is where he gets really reflective and he really starts to talk to the audience. And he says, not very long ago, just before your time, there was catalogs, travel blogs, a chat room or two. This is what the
Yeah.
internet was. And so he really takes the time to lay out the difference between that internet and the internet that we have today.
Yeah.
Also, right in that same verse, he comments on the relationship between children and technology and then their parents. You know, he says, "Mummy let you use her iPad, but you were barely two," and then
Barely two. Yeah.
which I think is it's a really poignant line there to say we, as the internet, had our claws into you at that point, or not even the internet, but the technology gods, right? The same people he mentioned in
Yeah.
Bezos 1 and Bezos 2, Zuckerberg and
And
Gates
then it
and
boils down to
Bezos.
that idea of addiction, doesn't it? Because actually, if you're into it at that age, that's all you know.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And yeah, apathy is a tragedy and boredom is a crime. A little bit of everything, or
Yeah.
anything and everything, all of the time, which is kind of
Yeah.
the modern psyche.
It
Um,
sort of sums up modern consumer culture, doesn't it?
yeah, and in that way, it really does tie back to that criticism of Bezos and Amazon as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, let's speed on through, Tom. The next song
Yeah.
is That Funny Feeling. Tell me about this one.
Yeah, so this I think is really interesting because it reflects how the internet has normalized commentary of tragedy. So you have moments of tragedy mixed in with sales and other things, and it sort of further builds on the idea of benefits and drawbacks of the internet.
Hmm.
And how well-intentioned use of technology can often even be damaged by the wrongful use of it, or poor coverage on the news, all of those sorts of things. So this is kind of taking Welcome to the Internet and then summarizing the shifts in culture, both for better and the worse. And I think it's really interesting how he juxtaposes some of the lyrics throughout this to really make you think about the poignancy of them.
Yeah, it really is a sequel to Welcome to the Internet, right?
Yeah,
It goes through all these kinds of markers of internet culture and like he says, Deadpool's self awareness, and just in that
yeah,
one line, he's really talking to the sort of postmodern pastiche referencing culture that we all kind of find on the internet nowadays. I think, yeah.
yeah,
It's also this one also, or at least the opening of it, is a little bit improvised as well. So
yeah,
he starts it off in this conversational tone, and in that way, it feels like the you know comedian on stage talking to a live
yeah.
audience, but of course there is no audience
It's
there. So
interesting because you've just made something click in my brain, which is that throughout this, the facade is fading. So throughout, you get more and more of organic Bo, showing how it's impossible to sustain an online persona.
mhm. And the next song, he loses that mask altogether, right?
Yeah,
And he just becomes this manic content creator demanding attention, demanding that you look at
yeah.
him.
I think that's the thing as well, is this song is so much about the traps of content creation and the need, like we were talking about earlier, for that instant gratification. Is when you're built into that sort of system, it becomes everything you crave. It's what you need, it's how you measure your sense of worth. And it can become massively destructive. Um So I think it's interesting because this sort of builds on several of the themes already, you know. I mean, you get the juxtaposition in the middle of this of Bo talking about his own mental health, how he had to work on himself mentally.
Mm-hmm.
So showing that sort of comparison again of what we put online versus what our real lives are actually like. But also you get a reflection on the lack of awareness for social issues that we've seen in other songs as well, because this is essentially apathy for people to not care whilst they seek attention elsewhere instead, or
Yeah.
whilst they engage with other content. So it sort of really drills down on some of the themes that are present throughout the piece, I think.
It really plays that tragedy for comedy too, right? He says, "Yeah, I was working on
Yeah,
myself and I was ready to get back out there and start performing again." And then, you know what? The funniest thing happened, which is, of course, not the funniest thing, but it. So in that sense, although it's a very personal commentary, it reflects for all of us the disruptions that happened, the weddings and
yeah,
birthdays that were missed, the relationships that broke down through distance or
yeah.
whatever it happened to be. Um, you know,
Almost the idea that this unseen force has control over everything, and even if you've planned for something, you can't control that.
yeah, it's it's Manic song, but I don't want to say that in that I'm diagnosing him in any way or anything like that. But the song um, builds this kind of tension or anxiety in me as a listener. I
Yeah,
think so. Yeah, it's a tough one actually to listen to.
it
Uh,
is. Yeah,
because it feels like you're seeing him almost snap at this point.
yeah.
And again, I think a lot of people reached that point during the pandemic. So yeah,
Yeah, I think you're spot on. This is kind of his breaking point in a way, and this is sort of where you see really, like I say, that facade fall away entirely, and you get the real perspective on the impact that it's had on him as a person.
and then we get to goodbye.
Yeah,
Is this
yeah. So
the end?
this, I think, this is really
The
interesting
the
because it's sort
denouement
of
as we, yeah.
it's a perspective on again online content creation, I think. So you have, do I really have to finish? Do returns always diminish? Which is the idea that once you put content out, you get your initial flurry of likes and then they disappear. Does anyone want to joke when no one is laughing in the background? Again, the idea of the lack of engagement and real social engagements and cues that give you the sense that you're doing well. I promise to never go outside again. The disparity between digital content creation and actually real life, and how do you
Mm,
transition between the two? And then how about I sit on the couch and I watch you next time is a whole piece around the judgment of content, how easy it is for people to judge others creating content online when they perhaps wouldn't want that judgment themselves.
could I get your reflections on that perspective? Have you felt that as a sort of creator?
It's interesting, yeah. I think the thing that always resonates with me is when I'll put out like a photograph on my Jurassic account, with a little description on it, and somebody will say something like, "Oh, that's not scientifically accurate," and then I sort of feel like that puts the onus on me to do my research next time and do better with it, and it's quite frustrating in some ways because that sort of, you feel that you constantly have in the back of your mind that whatever you're putting out, somebody could challenge at some point.
Yeah. Um, and the last one's barely a song.
Yeah,
Uh, it's goodbye was really the climax in terms
yeah.
of the songs within the show. But what do you think about Any Day Now?
I think it's just a reflection on really the pandemic again, and us just waiting for it to end, waiting to get back to some kind of normality. You know, that I think Inside as a whole piece, sort of goes through the goods and bads of the transition to a more digital lifestyle during the pandemic. And Any Day Now is then a reflection on people waiting to get back to some kind of normality that's more balanced.
Yeah, yeah. Um, what are your final thoughts on this one, Tom? On the whole thing?
Yeah. So it's a really interesting collection of work. I think that some of it is quite uncomfortable to listen to, and some of the jokes are very near the mark and potentially very insensitive. But I think that's done deliberately because each song here has got its own clear takeaways. It uses dark humor in some ways to juxtapose things and make sure that the key messaging gets through. And I think above all else, this piece of work is a real case study for digital creatives and particularly digital marketers working in this age, actually, that you really need to get creative for your message to break through the noise. And that actually, if you can communicate about something serious in a comical way or in a less serious way that's going to resonate with your audiences, that's ultimately how you get that message to stick. I mean, you look at Welcome to the Internet, it has 134 million views. And when you type in "we" on YouTube, it's the first thing that pops up.
Mm.
So you look at that as just a content piece that's being consumed alone and it's massively successful. But actually, there's some really, really interesting messaging behind that. And he's been able to get that to a huge audience just by using that comical tone. So it says a lot about how approaching your communication creatively and thinking about the tone is massively important in getting something to resonate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he probably does a really good job of connecting with the audience, right? He very
Yeah,
although although throughout it he's commenting from this position of authority, I guess, as a comedian, right? And it's almost a
yeah,
behind the stage look at the thought process and some of the things that go into doing that work. He's still uh, that aspect of it rather gives a kind of authenticity, I think, that really landed with the audience. And despite the technology barrier, despite the technology being the thing that this is accessed through, through YouTube and through the internet, and despite that technology being our only way of connecting throughout the pandemic,
yeah,
he really lands that message in an authentic way and in a way that resonated absolutely with the really targeted audience. It's not a collection of songs or a movie or a film or a special for um, people older than 40, I guess, to put it that way. Even though those experiences were shared globally, so thank you so much. If people want to look you up
yeah, no
online,
worries.
you can search for Tom Fishenden, but you're most well known as Tom Jurassic. I think where you're a
Yes.
creator. So yeah, if people are interested in Tom's creative work, go out and look him up. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Travis.
Thanks for listening. Background music by Audio Coffee.